Hi there, Margo here from IndieBirth, and I'm back with another really crucial topic. And this week I'm talking about the wise woman model of care. And we've been talking about this for a very long time here at IndieBirth. And in some ways it feels a little bit like, rehashing something for me, but I also really know the value of this conversation. And I'm going to be bringing something a little bit new to it today. I also have some stories for you to help illustrate what this looks like in practice. And it is really a foundational concept when someone is learning about birth and how birth could look and, radically reimagining the future of birth. And so hang with me for a little bit and let's talk about the wise woman model of care. So the first question people would maybe have is, what is it? What are we talking about? And the wise woman model of care, the language of that actually comes from a woman named Susun Weed, who's an herbalist. And she talks about this model in her book, Healing Wise. It is not necessarily applied specifically to birth in her book. It's more about healing in general and health and making choices about our bodies. And Marin was really inspired by this book, as was I, but Marin was the one who kind of put it into words, like translated her work into words and a model in midwifery. And so when Susun Weed talks about the wise woman model of care, she's really talking about this messy, spiral, intuition-based approach to health and healing, something that's not linear, something that's much more feminine and much less masculine than the linear approach to health and healing that is rampant in Western medicine. So the wise woman model is very much rooted in whoever's needing the healing, them looking inside themselves and asking what they need and sort of approaching health and healing from a less is more perspective. And then as, things unfold or become more intense or more serious, or as those lower intervention things maybe don't work or give the health and healing that is required or needed, we kind of move up the scale. So she also talks about the 6 steps of healing, which I'm not going to get into right now, but it's basically that, starting with what if we do nothing in this moment, and then gradually increasing the intensity of interventions all the way up through surgery, if surgery is required in the case of whatever health need might be presenting. So there's a big spectrum in there, but the wise woman model is a process of the person who is doing the healing, or in this case, with birth and midwifery, the person who's doing the birthing, the woman who's doing the birthing, looking inside herself and asking, what do I need? Intuitively, what do I feel I need? What are my options? Where on this 6 steps of healing maybe am I wanting to start? And then, experimenting, trying things out and seeing if they work, and reassessing over and over again. So it's very much based in radical self-responsibility. And this is different. You might think of this as kind of like choosing off of a menu, which is very much a way that I've approached midwifery with my clients. It's like, here's the menu of options. Which of these things would you like? Which of these things don't make sense for you? Which is radically different than the approach that most women and the model that most women are receiving care in Westernized cultures, which is very much checkbox based. It's very black and white, algorithm based, and you show up and you do X, Y, and Z at every appointment. You also do tests at these different timelines that are prescribed. If something pops up, like, let's say a baby is measuring small on a routine ultrasound, now that means it triggers this other avalanche of things, kind of no matter what, follow-up testing, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's not a lot of thought happening on the part of the practitioner or the woman who is pregnant. It is very much, we just show up and we do the things in the order that is prescribed, and that's that. Okay, so, there's a lot of different names for that approach. I'm just going to leave it at, that's the mainstream model. That's what most people are familiar with and have experienced themselves if they've entered that world. And there's very little room, sometimes no room, for making alternative choices that are not part of the sequence of events or the sequence of the algorithm based on, the numbers and data that's coming in about your body from all these routine tests. And I am not saying, and the wise woman model is not saying, that testing is bad. It is that unquestioning routine testing for all doesn't make sense. And instead, it invites us to really think about our own bodies, our own histories, our own needs, our unique physiology, and what is appropriate for us, and for us to make that choice from a place of like, this is right for me, instead of this is just routine. So that's like a basic breakdown of what the wise woman model of care is compared to the typical Western mainstream model of care in birth. And I want to talk a little bit about the obstacles to the wise woman model of care. And I want to share a couple real life stories and then some final thoughts. So, obstacles to the wise woman model of care. I'm going to drink some water here. I'm getting froggy in my throat. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of obstacles. So, cultural and societal conditioning are a huge piece of what is keeping us from practicing in the wise woman model of care in the US and other places. Women are taught to, from a very young age, defer to experts rather than trust themselves. So we cannot have a midwifery that operates within the wise woman model of care if we do not have women who are ready to participate fully in this model, which requires radical responsibility and choice making and sovereignty, as opposed to deferring to an external authority. So that's the number one problem I feel in the world, not just in birth, is this cultural conditioning, the societal conditioning to defer to experts instead of to our own intuition, and also not just our own intuition, but our own critical thinking skills. I think both of those things are important. And I'll talk maybe a little bit about that when I talk about an example. The medicalization of birth is another obstacle. So interventions are framed as necessary rather than optional. There's this sort of hubris in the medical mainstream model around like, we know how to do this. We can do it right. We're the ones who know how to handle this and make birth safe. And the reality is, if you really drill down into policies and protocols and the way that they impact outcomes and like the evidence, very little of what we actually are doing, very little of the policies that are in place, very little of the checklists that are triggered with different, gray area, maybe normal, maybe not normal things that can come up. And even some things that are clearly not normal. The way that we handle them and the approaches to dealing with them are questionable at best. There's very few things in the birth and obstetrical world very few interventions where it's extremely clear cut that we know exactly the best way to handle them. An example of this, of one of the places where it is clear cut, is something like placental abruption. If someone's having an extreme placental abruption where the placenta is coming away from the uterus and she's losing blood, the baby's losing oxygenation because their placental, atmosphere and environment is now not optimal, right? They're not getting the amount of oxygenated blood through the placenta that they need to be. That is a clear case of either get the baby out as quickly as you can vaginally or go have a cesarean right this moment. Like, that's a clear-cut situation where an intervention makes sense and there's no real debate. But there are very, very few of those scenarios, and there's way, way, way more, like 90+% of the scenarios that come up during pregnancy and birth, where there is room for debate, like, lively, logical debate about how we should best proceed based on the information that we currently have. And hopefully that changes in the next, 50 to 100 years. Hopefully there's a lot more research done, some maybe new technologies that are invented or put into practice. And, maybe some things will become a lot more clear cut. But right now, and I'm really running with this one, right now there is just an overconfidence in the mainstream model about how to proceed with basically anything. So the wise woman model of care doesn't really fit because there's so much certainty, even though it's not warranted, if that makes sense. So if somebody says, okay, well, my baby's measuring small on ultrasound and I just want to wait and see, when they really want to continue doing serial monitoring, like, there's not room for that conversation, even though that's a very reasonable conversation to have, perhaps, depending on the scenario. Other obstacles are legal and regulatory barriers. Licensed midwives often cannot fully support this model if they are going to stay within the bounds of their licensing. And, doctors and nurses in the hospital and midwives in the hospital, same thing, not necessarily legally speaking, but the policies in the hospital can very much restrict what they are able to do and offer to their clients. A lack of community support. So women choosing autonomy often feel isolated. They feel like the black sheep. They feel like they are the only ones out there kind of doing this. And that can lead to social isolation. It can lead to friends and family who are questioning their choices and the larger community not being supportive of their approach to birth. There's financial and accessibility barriers. We don't have to get super into that, but wise woman care is rarely covered by insurance. If that's something someone is dependent upon or relying upon, that's a whole big other conversation. Some people don't understand the value either. Another obstacle, fear and self-doubt. Many women have never seen a physiological birth happen, right, without medical management. They don't even know what's possible. And midwives navigating this role, even if the licensing piece is not part of the puzzle for them, balancing guidance as a midwife while honoring someone's autonomy and then honoring your own autonomy can be a really challenging line to walk. And it's something that we've been supporting midwives with and thinking about and talking about and, doing here at IndieBirth for a really long time. But I do recognize that could be challenging. So I wanted to share a client story. So this one, I don't know if it's the best example, but it's the one that came to mind. So maybe it is. There's a reason perhaps that is eluding me at the moment. But the one that came to mind was a client I had early on as an independent midwife myself, who, it was her second baby. It was her first home birth. And at her anatomy scan around 20 weeks that she decided she wanted, they saw that her placenta was low lying. So she did not have a placenta previa. It was close to her cervix though. So the placenta, if this is her cervix, the placenta came to about here. It was about 2 centimeters from her cervix. And they wanted her to get another ultrasound to rule out placenta previa and to make sure that it had moved or not gotten any closer to the cervix before labor. And so I shared with this mom all of the research information, knowledge that I had about this scenario. And the research shows that most placentas that were as far from the cervix as hers was are either farther away or not any closer to the cervix when rechecked at 36 weeks. I don't have the research in front of me. I'd have to pull up the exact stats, but the vast majority had resolved on their own by term. And I left it up to her. I said, you're totally welcome to get a follow-up ultrasound. It is not something that I feel like I need to have. It's not a piece of information I feel like I need to have as a midwife. There are other signs if the placenta is too low lying and too close to the cervix, like warning bleeds in the 3rd trimester as it gets closer, as you get closer to term. If there was any kind of weird bleeding in labor, I would also want to transport you to the hospital, kind of no matter what, but especially if we know that this was a possibility. So those were sort of the main talking points that she and I talked through. And she decided that she did not want to do a follow-up ultrasound. She wanted to just wait and see. And all was well. Had a very boringly normal couple hour long labor, had a great home birth. She did have a little bit more bleeding postpartum, which can happen with low-lying placentas. We handled it with herbs and rest and my hands and, just basic midwifery skills and tools. Not a big deal. She was interviewed actually by, and maybe this is why it came to mind. Actually, this makes sense now. She was interviewed by NPR, not NPR, but NPR, Minnesota Public Radio. They did a couple pieces on midwifery a bunch of years ago, probably in 2019, 2020, somewhere in there, pre-COVID. But post my son being born, he was born in May of 2019, and he was a baby when they came to interview me. And so they interviewed me and they interviewed this client as part of a piece on midwifery licensing, which, side note, just don't ever talk to journalists. I totally was like, oh, they want to learn about unlicensed midwifery in Minnesota, and how great will that be? And the piece was fine. The quotes that I had in it were great. The quotes that my client had in it were great, but it was very clear that this journalist didn't actually give a shit about midwifery and was just trying to stir the pot and wasn't really actually supportive of what I was doing at all. And it felt really gross afterwards that she had come into my home and taken photos with me and my kids and talked to my client. But anyways, in this article, they interviewed her and they sort of painted this choice as reckless because it was not standard of care. And I would argue that this was a fantastic example of the wise woman model of care, and it worked out great. The outcome was fantastic. This woman could not have been happier with how her birth went. And I felt totally comfortable as her midwife. I had no concerns or fears going into the birth. It was fine, but the way that this journalist painted it, you could go read it. Maybe I'll put it in the show notes, the link to this article. The way that she painted it was, well, in the medical world, if you see a low-lying placenta at an anatomy scan, you of course do a follow-up. And it's ignoring the part where the woman gets to decide that herself. And she sort of made it seem like I had maybe convinced this client to not do a follow-up, or that us radical, weird home birth people just were anti-technology, which of course ignores that this mom made the choice in the first place to have an anatomy scan at all. So it's sort of like the mainstream model doesn't really know what to do with people who want to engage in some ways with the tools and technology that are available, but not then fall down the cascade of interventions or follow the algorithm or follow the checklist afterwards. That just there's not a lot of space for that. There's sometimes zero space for that in the mainstream model. So the other example I want to talk about is my own birth and pregnancies. I'll just talk about my first birth, my first full-term birth, and leave the other one. They're kind of similar-ish stories, but with my daughter, she was born in 2014, I had hypertension. I had chronic hypertension prior to pregnancy that I controlled more or less with lifestyle, herbs, that sort of thing, on and off through my life. It started when I was a teenager. So I had chronic hypertension, but I didn't actually actively have it when I went into her pregnancy. But by 24 weeks, I did have gestational hypertension in that pregnancy. And this could be like a 6-hour long thing. So I'm going to keep it really brief. If you're curious to learn more, maybe I'll do an expanded version at some point. But I took blood pressure medication in that pregnancy, and it just didn't work super well. It didn't control my blood pressure as tightly as one would hope, kind of no matter what my dosage was. So I ended up going to an OB at one point. I did not see an OB at all. I just happened to have this hypertension medication prescription from pre-pregnancy, so I had access to it, to the medication that I wanted. And toward the end of my pregnancy, at about 34 weeks, I had an appointment with a doctor to talk about the medication, to figure out, like, is there something else I could be doing? Is there a different kind I could try? That sort of thing. And I had let him know ahead of time, like, I'm just here to talk about my medication and my hypertension and how to best manage this. I'm not here to be talked out of having a home birth, because that is what I'm doing. I did say if I had developed preeclampsia, or if I felt intuitively like I needed to switch my plan to do a hospital birth, that I also would like to connect with someone and have a relationship should I need that. And despite all of that, of course, at the actual appointment, this doctor very much tried to talk me out of having a home birth. And wasn't actually very helpful at all with my medication stuff, other than saying, like, yeah, just take more. It was useless. Anyways, he suggested, this was at 34 weeks of pregnancy, he said, if you have not developed preeclampsia by 37 weeks, then I want to induce you in the hospital, and you will not be able to use any water, like the pool or anything. I need you to be, like, in the bed, mandatory epidural to keep your blood pressure lower, to keep your pain levels lower, to keep your blood pressure levels lower, probably a magnesium drip, and, just all the things, right? So 37 weeks, an induction, medical management, the most medical birth you can possibly imagine. And this is with the first baby. And of course, I knew that that was not what I wanted at all. And I knew that my chances of having a vaginal birth in a setting like that, with that kind of, especially with that kind of thinking, where it was like, there was not even room for me to say, oh, actually, I don't even want to have an epidural, even if you do think that would be a better choice. So in that mainstream model of care, I knew I didn't want that. I knew that what I wanted wouldn't fit in with that, unless I got to the point where it did feel like the right thing, if that makes sense. So anyways, this doctor was obviously concerned about my plan to have a home birth. He said it was not safe. He did not recommend it. And he instead recommended this other extremely medical and, again, the checkbox approach to my scenario, which was, your blood pressure is too high. And when your blood pressure is high in pregnancy, this is what we do, period. And so in some ways that was a real blessing for me, because I left being like, and I had done a lot of research. I tried to find the most open-minded, most kind, gentle obstetrician in the state of Arizona. I had traveled pretty far to see him. And I thought to myself, like, and said out loud to my now ex-husband, but husband at the time, that if that's my other option, it makes it very clear that even though I do have concerns about having a home birth, even though I do have fears, like, that is still the better option for me, because I know that I cannot enter into a world where my voice doesn't matter and my choices aren't honored as sacred. And so I went forward with the home birth. I went into labor on my due date, so at 40 weeks. She was born 3 days later. It was long, grueling, hard. You can read all about it, and there's actually a video you can watch here on YouTube if you want to, of me pushing her out triumphantly. And the outcome was great. All was well. So I sent him a photo of me, naked on my bedroom floor holding my baby, letting him know that some of the details of the story, and saying, like, just so you know, I took this very different approach because it's what felt right to me, because I had weighed my options. I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles about hypertension in pregnancy and the risks and the, the possibilities. And what to watch for, of course, and I was studying midwifery, and I got to a place where I felt like my very best option, my very best choice was to do it this way. And look, it worked out. And I'm not saying that that's the right choice for every person that has hypertension in pregnancy at all. I'm just saying, like, that is what made sense for me, and it worked out despite, eschewing and, not following the checklist. So again, I don't want to paint this picture of like, oh, the wise woman model of care always ends in a great outcome. It always ends in a live baby. Like, I very much understand and respect that like things could have gone wrong in my birth. They could go wrong at any birth. There's no guarantee of any outcome, whether we follow the rules or not, because statistics are real. I do believe in them. I like them. I've done undergraduate and graduate level stats classes. I think it's fascinating, but at the end of the day, you are a person, not a statistic, and you don't know if you're going to be one of the, in my case, my biggest concern was placental abruption, and there was about a 4% chance of that happening. So I didn't know if I was going to be in the 4% who did have a placental abruption, which would have been possibly tragic and terrible, or if I was going to be in the 96% that didn't have that happen at all and had a normal, straightforward birth. And in a perfect world, I wouldn't have had to make that choice. I would have been able to find somewhere where I could birth exactly how I wanted to, low intervention, with a midwife, unmedicated, in a comfortable environment, eating, drinking, all those things, and had access to emergency help readily and quickly if and when I needed it. Like, I don't want to pretend like that isn't the dream, because that absolutely would have been the right choice for me. That would have been perfect for me and for many women who find themselves in these medium risk, high risk, situations. But when forced to choose between a medicalized model of care that doesn't respect autonomy and choice and the wise woman model of care, a lot of us do choose the wise woman model of care, even though there is inherent risk no matter what, but especially when we are medium or higher risk. So those are just two stories of how that looks. And I want to make it really clear, especially speaking about my own experiences with, exercising my voice within the wise woman model of care. And I did have a midwife, it was Marin, who loved me and trusted me and believed in me and supported my choices. I just want to really reiterate, though, that like this wasn't a simple one-time choice. This was like a daily choosing, and it was not without anxiety. It was not some romantic like I just knew in my soul that home birth was the right thing for me. It was a daily process that I think a lot of women aren't really willing to engage in, because it's easier to just say, I'm going to go to the doctor and I'm going to do whatever they say I'm supposed to do. I'm going to show up to my 37-week induction and I'll get that epidural they said was mandatory. And I have no judgment about this. I just want to be clear. If that is what somebody chooses and wants, then that is totally fine. I'm just saying that it is to operate within the wise woman model of care as the pregnant woman and also as the midwife. It is a constant, the spiral is the symbol of the wise woman model of care. It's this constant circling back in, circling back out, and choosing actively every step of the way, which is more energy intensive. It's more like emotionally intense and mentally intense, spiritually intense than, handing our power over. And like I said, I understand why women often, like most women in our culture, make that choice to just hand their power over. And I also still believe deep inside that having more opportunity for the wise woman model of care in home births, in birth centers, in hospital settings, in some place, this mythical, beautiful place that doesn't really exist yet, like some, sanctuary, a birth sanctuary. Having more access to the wise woman model of care is only a good thing for us as a society and as humans. So yeah, my final thoughts are just that the wise woman model of care is a radical act in a world that prioritizes control over intuition and control over following our own voice and our own truth. It requires deep trust. It requires community. It requires a willingness to challenge conventional narratives about birth. And it's a model that I feel like is continually evolving and sort of shape-shifting and is being built or rebuilt in real time. And so that is, I think, one of the reasons that birth videos and birth stories are so popular and so effective in being part of this like birth revolution, is that, you know, seeing it in action, like seeing is believing, and seeing it in action helps us understand the model better, helps us embody it more, and it also shows us places where we could be doing better. So I'd be curious if you want to share in the comments, how do you see this model evolving? What obstacles have you faced in practicing it or supporting it? And yeah, any other thoughts that you have that this little conversation brought up, I'd be so excited to hear from you. I love hearing what these videos stimulate out there in the world. It doesn't feel good to feel like I'm just talking into a void. So if this impacted you at all, please, like, I legitimately am inviting you to either comment below or email me. I would love to hear from you. Margo at IndieBirth.org is where you can always get me. And next week, I'm going to talk more specifically about autonomy for midwives and why it's needed now more than ever. So stick with me on this journey through the year here, where I'm going to just keep doing these deep dives into these topics that I think are the most relevant as we reimagine midwifery together.